Welcome back, everybody. We're walking towards the Powhatan Indian village, and one of the things that's important about the Indian culture to recognize is that their religious beliefs was ultimately either animistic or environmental pantheism, wherein they worshiped the elements of creation itself. Instead of the God of creation, they worshipped the creation. And this had devastating, to some effects, aspects on their culture and their life and how they live, because there's cultural blessings that come with worshiping the true God, and there are cultural curses that come with not. And as they refused to do that, there was situations like this. Consider this tree foliage, the covering. They would not cut down trees, and so you would have been able to walk from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi, never seeing the sun. There's so much tree coverage, and that meant that the only place that the wildlife really lived, the deer, which was a staple element for their diet, was on the various hunting grounds. And those were areas where there had been clearings made, and they were able to have an abundant deer population. So whenever there's situations like that where there's not enough food, they would come to the settlers. When the settlers came here and they started clearing forests, they started opening up various passages and increased the deer population immensely. The Indians would come. It's easily accessible to get the deer there, and the cattle didn't taste quite so bad either.
So, some of you may have heard of The Last of the Mohicans. There's a movie made about it in Hollywood. There's a book called Deer Slayer that the same author, James Fenimore Cooper, wrote, which is a fun piece of Americana fiction with some interesting anecdotal evidence in it. But one of the things it presents this culture that the settlers came to as is very idyllic. The idea of the noble savage and conservation specifically is a thing that we kind of blame ourselves for not doing, and say that the indigenous tribes that were here definitely practiced. So here are some of the conservation methods they employed. We often hear of their oneness with nature, respect for animals, but they actually did a lot of hunting and gathering and used up the natural resources in an area and then moved on. They were perpetual nomads because of their lifestyle, and they were not conservationists. So one of the most popular hunting methods was to light a large patch of forest on fire, stand at the other end, and wait for whatever came out and shoot it. That was their methodology for hunting a lot of the time, which meant that they did have to move frequently. And starvation was a common thing among them when they weren't dying of various diseases. We've talked about why many diseases were not actually European in origin. Some were, but not all. And their survival methods stripped the land of easily usable natural resources. So this is something to keep in mind. This produced cannibalism, infanticide, and all other versions of death because of the lifestyle that the people here were living under. Very hard conditions.
Right, so we're actually here in there's Kevin and Soph. They're looking around. They made a reproduction little Indian village here, and just continuing from what Em was saying, they were definitely savages. We get the word cannibal from the Indians because when game would get scarce, they would resort to eating themselves, and so lots of cannibalism.
Very harsh, hard way to live.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think though one thing to remember too with that survival of the fittest mentality came some pretty incredible genetic traits. They were impressive foes.
Yeah.
They had incredible pain tolerance, incredible tenacity and endurance. They were able to survive blizzard. A 4-year-old could survive a blizzard. They had some of their traditions are just crazy. I think over here. Oh, can you see it? Oh, well, maybe we'll walk by it in a minute here. But there's like a setup they have for their Sundance, their manhood, arrival at manhood.
I'll post a picture or video of it. I got one.
Sure, yeah. And that entailed an older, brave, cutting out a piece of muscle in their back and attaching
a strap of rawhide?
Yeah, a strap of leather to it, and they dance around this pole. And for 3 days celebrating the glories of manhood, and if they fainted, you know, they could try again next year. Just extreme tenacity, and so there's some things that are admirable about just their sense of dignity, and they refuse to become slaves, and at the same time just all that potential wasted in deep paganism, and lots of killing each other, lots of death, and they were fueled by, Kevin was talking about earlier, the peyote cult. I mean, I think that's a more modern term, but they had medicine doctors that weren't even really popular in their village, but these
They held great spiritual sway.
yeah, these witch doctors would basically get everybody high on drugs, and there was lots of demon possession, and they would incite wars, and so they used fear tactics, and that's how they had power. And so when the Christians would come and the Indians were tempted by the more peaceful lifestyle, the witch doctors would become very threatened, and so they'd have to incite insurrections and wars and all kinds of butchery and savagery. So I think it's important to understand that what we've understood, what we've been taught about the Indian is not true. There are incredibly impressive things about their culture, and then there are really sad, savage things about their culture. So Kurtis is going to tell us about this particular tribe that the Jamestown settlers encountered.
Yeah, so the Jamestown settlers encountered an Algonquian tribe, and they're surprised, and there was a lot of fear on both sides of the Native Americans. So the Native Americans didn't understand the settlers, and the settlers, of course, didn't understand the Native Americans, though they had some knowledge because of intertrade conversations that had taken place by some Native Americans that had been brought back to England and such. So they had some knowledge of the culture, but like Powhatan, he was the main chief of the region. He had inherited 4 tribes from his father, and then he conquered another 20 tribes. So he was a very, very feared individual. He was very strong, powerful. He was called an emperor today, and rightly so. He had subjected many under his rule. And so that's the type of culture that the colonists encountered, and that is the culture that survived and had to come to terms with understanding of the English had to come in terms of understanding who they were, and the native population had to understand who the English were.
Yeah, and you were going to talk about Pocahontas, right?
Yeah, so Powhatan is the father of Pocahontas, and that is the one who rescued John Smith.
You get to tell that story in our
Yeah,
next slide.
we'll tell that story a little bit later here, but yeah, that is...
This is the setting for Pocahontas and the Powhatans and
all that they encountered at Jamestown.
right.